Buju, Badamini Kwe, Indigenous Cost, National Kwe, Gigun Odadem. Thanks all for having me. I'm excited to share this work with you tonight, and it was excited to learn about your series. And I'm going to dive right in and tell you a little bit. Hopefully, I'll be able to share things that will spur your thinking tonight. So it's probably important to kind of know where am I coming from and how do I think about this work. And for me, I'm always really trying to think about what I see as the central possibility and challenge of the 21st century. And that's living in and transforming the Anthropocene towards cultivating just, culturally thriving, and sustainable communities. So across my work for the last 2 decades, 3 decades, I've been really thinking about how should, and you can say science education, but I think about it much more broadly than just science education now, contribute to the broad scale socio-ecological change that human communities and more than human communities need. And so it's really a question of how do we contribute to families, communities, and Earth's thriving. And for me in particular, that means I'm always asking questions about what forms of teaching and learning do we need right now. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is give you, it's kind of do a talk in 3 parts. I'm going to try to give you some big picture ideas, issues, and possibilities that kind of ground me. And then I'm going to try to give you 2 examples, one of which is the Learning in Places project that is much bigger than Seattle now. So I'll be able to tell you about that. But across the talk, partly what I'm hoping to kind of illuminate is issues of Indigenous erasure and presence around human supremacy and its creation, white human supremacy, and kind of thinking a little bit about the reproductions and disruptions in teaching and learning environments that are at least in my work and in my worlds have helped to create actually thriving possibilities. One thing to know that none of the work that I'm showing you tonight is actually mine alone. I have been doing this work in partnership with both tribal communities and communities of color for 2 decades now. And so you're getting parts of all of that. Part of what you should understand and how I come to this work is really some fundamental propositions that what I call nature-culture relations, or the relational controls between human worlds and the natural world, or the more than human world, are foundational. And I've been up to studying 2 core models of this, what we might call a part of models and apart from models. And you can see in the graphic on the right, these are kind of what these look like. And we've done that through studying cognitive models of human reasoning and knowledge building, but also how it shows up in learning environments. And I think for tonight, one of the things that's really important to understand is that these 2 models, they shape human activity. They're shaped by knowledge systems and values. They are shaped by power and historicity, and they shape how power and historicity is playing out. They're also foundational to human development and cognition, and they can figure centrally in learning environments. And I'm going to try to dig into this. But one of the things that I want everyone to kind of hold is these apart from models in my work and in lots of other people's work. This is not just me alone that thinks this, that apart from models have really been foundational to Western knowledge systems, and how it is that we've even gotten to the Anthropocene, in which kind of human entitlement and extraction is a big paradigm that has been enabled. It also is the paradigm that has been centrally imposed through colonialism on Indigenous communities. So I want to hold both of those things across this. And for me, thinking about this is not just an issue of justice, but it's also central to the kind of adaptation and resiliency demands that we're facing collectively. As an example, and I always do this because most people don't have any idea about this, is that in the United States in particular, and many other places, people are systematically educated to be operating from Indigenous absence. I love this map. This map of the purple shows the distribution of Indigenous territories globally. Most people have no idea that 1/4 of all habitable land is still governed by Indigenous peoples, and that anywhere to 85% of the world's biodiversity is still in our territories, and yet we're at the sort of forefront of climate change. So when we think about why we're so slow to do big scale policy about climate change and adaptation, one of the things that is also a politic of is Indigenous sacrificability, meaning that we're on the front lines, people acting slow to make big changes hurts us first and foremost. The other thing to hold is that these apart from models are dominating across education and everyday life. So there's been huge shifts in how much time the average American child spends outdoors in the last 50 or 60 years. It's how we've approached content learning or disciplinary learning. The US has invested in a lab-based science infrastructure, not field-based as an example. Just to say, it's not to say that we shouldn't do lab-based sciences, but we really only do lab-based sciences, and we put children inside buildings for 8 or plus hours a day. We've done studies to demonstrate that this is infrastructured in a representational ecosystem, think curriculum, children's books, all of that. And then there's really interesting stuff about how time indoors and outdoors are correlated with human health and mental health. That's a different talk though. So part of what I want you to hear is that apart from models, are increasingly have really solid evidence that they're associated with kind of human-centric reasoning, not whole systems, and not an unsustainable decision-making. And part of what I'm arguing here is that we have an education system that is facilitating apart from models, and we need a transformation. I'm also arguing, and I just want to be clear about this, is that we have this apart from model and we have this systemically producing Indigenous absence. I can't give a talk without talking about this anymore, but so across our standards, our teacher prep, our curricular resources, it's really important that only 50% of states require teaching about Indigenous peoples at all in the United States. And 87% of US educational standards dictate the teaching of Indigenous peoples in the context of pre-1900, which means our systems are producing historicized Indians as the base model of understanding about Native people. And it means that it continues to actually enable systematic racism and challenges for Native peoples. I also like to point out is that this large, there's really good research that has demonstrated that this much of a systemic absence is actually correlated with the really outsized issues of suicidation amongst Indigenous youth. And a key issue is that children's capacities for suicidation are increased when they can't imagine a present or future self. Well, if you're going to schools where this is the content that you learned all the time, that's partly how you get there. For all of you who might be wondering, 2019 study demonstrated that even in language arts and social studies, 8th grade teachers say 73% they never or only once a year mention Native people or teach about Native people, just once a year. In mathematics by 8th grade, it's 88%. Say never or once a year. So we have a systemic problem of Indigenous absence and the kinds of erasures it produces. So those two pieces are kind of always feeding my work, and I'm going to try to get to some examples. But before I get there, I also want to say that part of the reason I think that I've really been up to these, a part of models, is also because I think it affords all kinds of new opportunities and to really make socio-ecological systems, learning, and decision-making kind of central to the endeavor of education. But I also think that these field-based models or a part of models, I always have to like use a couple of different terms so audiences can kind of connect. But it's also really a deep way to rethink about how we might engage learners' cultures, identities, and everyday lives towards consequential learning. And I'll say more about these two questions in a minute. I think the other thing that's important as educators to realize is that there's huge shifting conceptual paradigms across multiple disciplines that are relevant, even if you don't buy all of my argument yet. Right? There's massive upheavals happening in the world of botany and biology, even in how we think about evolution. So, turns out plants have memory and they learn and they have communicative capacities. There is all kinds of legal infrastructures that are transforming, and even economics. So this paper on the right is from Nature and talking about what it means to think about economic theory in a circular way. So the point is that even the deepest disciplines are going through some important transformations that I think as educators, it's super important for us to have our eye on. An example of this is that we know that inequality is deeply shaping the base scientific enterprise that often many of us are responsible for thinking about. And it's doing it on lots of levels, whether it's through actually production of science, but also science itself. This paper around colonial history and global economics is distorting understandings of deep time biodiversity is because it's funding particular approaches to understanding deep time biodiversity. So partly what I want you to hear is that there's actually the ground for really transformative things in lots of ways. My favorite example, and you'll see me pull this through, is this book called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, which if you haven't read, you should. But it's really the story of a huge transformation in the field of plant sciences over the last 30 years, where we went from not imagining that anyone besides humans had deep communicative capacity, learning capacity, memory capacity, to recognizing that actually forests are whole communities. And Suzanne says, I watched the forest and I listened. I followed where my curiosity led me, and I listened to the stories of my family and people, and I learned from scholars. So she was drawing on multiple knowledge sources, and I'm not going to read all of this, but what you should know is that she is actually the one that opened up understanding that tree-to-tree communication is happening in really complex ways, that trees actually cultivate soil in particular ways. They respond to harms, both for themselves, but for other trees. And that plants, trees in particular, but plants have the capacity to know which plants are actually their offspring. So there's all kinds of unbelievably cool science that has emerged in the last 30 years that literally sounds like 30 years ago, sounded like science fiction, and is very far from the things that we're teaching kids right now. And so I think what she ends up saying is the old trees nurture the young ones and provide them food and water. And more, these old trees are mothering their children. So cutting edge scientist is really transforming paradigms. I also think as we think about these things, to recognize that it's happening at the highest policy levels. This is something that, to be honest, I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. Almost a year ago, the White House committed to elevating Indigenous knowledge systems in federal policy decisions through the Office of Science and Technology. We certainly don't currently have a K-12 system that engages Indigenous knowledge in this kind of way, or even thinks it should. So the point is, there are movements all over that ask us to think about what it means to engage in teaching and learning kind of much differently than we have. And if you're wondering, I just want to say that these issues of Indigenous presence and multiple ways of knowing are really central to everyone, not just Native peoples. And I think that as you're listening today, while I'll be talking about Indigenous people specifically in example 1, in example 2, we'll kind of pull that through to see what's it look like in multiracial, multilingual learning environments. Okay, so part 2 of this is I'm going to really, I want to dive in. I think it's really important for people to understand these huge issues in really specific ways with kids learning. I show this example a lot because it does a lot of work around really developing these big ideas into really specific things. And so this project is we call it iSTEAM, but it's really thinking about climate education in informal environments. And this particular part that I'm going to show you is from a Seattle-based project. So what we were really after is designing learning environments. This is a 2-week summer program for 1st through 12th graders. It served about 40 to 60 students, all Native children. And what we were really, it was 2 weeks of investigating these 2 big questions. How are our homelands and waters in the Puget Sound being impacted by climate change and ocean acidification? And what should we do? What are our responsibilities? And what they did and what we designed for is that kids investigated biodiversity, ecological systems, and systems perturbations in and across ocean ecosystems, forest ecosystems, wetlands, and then microprairie systems. And one of the things that's important to know is that we were really after learning environments that kind of generally supported kids engaging both and developing kind of expertise in Indigenous knowledge systems, but also productively with Western knowledge systems. And to us, that's kind of a remaking of power relations that is really antithetical to how those relationships have been construed over time. What I'm going to try to show you is, I'm going to show you an example, but I want to just say a couple of key design features for these learning environments. So we were obviously insisting on Indigenous presence, and we use Indigenous stories and frameworks throughout. We made cultural practices routine in learning environments. And one of the core things that you'll see that is sort of central to a lot of Indigenous knowledge systems is recognizing what people have called the personhood of more than humans. That is their agency and their capacities quite differently than sort of reductive species. In the same way that Suzanne Simard, the botanist, just was talking about trees. She's recognizing trees' capacities through a kind of personhood lens. This is different than anthropomorphizing or personifying. It's actually expanding what we imagine other species capable of. And this is partly about pushing on kind of human species or human supremacy as a way of enacting learning environments. The other thing you should know is that these were intergenerational learning environments. Turns out age segregation is a newer development in human communities and certainly not central to indigenous communities. In fact, it's a newer thing since the Industrial Revolution and wartime for all communities. And partly what I want everyone to hear is that we were always taking up these decision-making kinds of questions in a way to think about what it means to uphold indigenous sovereignty and kind of all the way across, right? So it's really actually recognizing that indigenous presence and sovereignty is an ongoing act, and being in solidarity with that means constantly asking those questions. So what I'm going to do is show you a kind of quick arc of an example here and show you some data from a student, so we can kind of get into like, so what did navigating different knowledge systems look like, and how can you see a heterogeneity of knowing and learning environments as valuable differently than I think we often do. So in this example, we first started with what we were calling remaking plant relatives as a storyline, and we collectively learned about Western red cedar. And then we had all the kids break up into smaller groups, and they did more individual investigations around a keystone or a culturally salient plant of the local ecosystem. And then groups had to share what they learned from their investigations with other groups. So as an example, this is what kiddos did. All kids learned about cedar, cedar's role in forest ecosystems and its impacts on climate change. We started with a traditional story. They got to engage in forming a relationship with cedar. They did an investigation about cedar's roles and contributions to forest ecosystems. They collected some observational data. And then they also learned a little bit about what the challenges are for red cedar given climate change and kind of a range of kind of factors that are happening and shifting in red cedar forests. They also engaged in cultural practices of making and sharing with cedar, and then made recommendations to broader community and their family about what our responsibilities were. So I'm going to show you a video, but to do that, you need to know enough about the story that launched the investigations, which was the grandmother cedar story, which is a Samish story. And one thing to hold is that in indigenous knowledge systems, our stories are our theories. They're frameworks for how to know and be in the world. They're not fables. And we took that deeply seriously. And in this investigation started with grandmother cedar, which is a story about a grandmother cedar who is lonely and wants relatives. She's gifted a grandson to raise, and she protects that grandson from too much sun, too much wind, too much rain, or from other animals like deer eating him. In the story, she attends to his emotional well-being. She supports him and she grows old and weak, and he grows strong. And the story really, I'm not telling you it all on purpose, but he demonstrated, the grandson demonstrates reciprocity and ends up playing the same role for the grandmother. What you should get from this is that the story demonstrates interspecies relationships, intergenerationality of caring, both competition in food, but also helping in reciprocity. And if you all have ever been in a Pacific Northwest forest, you'll know that nursery logs are sort of the central of them. Nursery logs are here on the left, and we might think about those as old grandmother cedar. Okay. So now I'm going to show you what happened about 12 hours later in instruction after that story and after the investigation when kids have done their own investigations and they're sharing. So I'm going to show you a clip between two small groups, both made up of 3 kids, where one group has just shared about big leaf maple, which is a plant species that is also a tree species that is important. And kids have already done their investigations and they're really teaching each other. In this activities, we called it a plant relative walk. It was kind of a hop along where each group had to go see the other group and do some knowledge sharing. And I'm going to show you a clip. The group, Una, Renee, and Sarah have already kind of done the majority of what they plan to share. And now I'm going to show you kind of the spontaneous conversation, both questions from the kids, but also questions from the teacher. And if you can't hear this, I'm going to show you a transcript afterwards, so don't worry, but try to pick up what you can.
So when the leaves of the maple tree die, they fall on the ground and they compost, and that's really good soil for the rest of the plants. And over towards here, there's sproutlings. I'm not really sure of what plant, but there's some little guys going over towards here. Yes, right around. Do you have any more interesting fun facts? Are you trying to be sarcastic? No. Also, not shielding. They kind of like the grandma cedar tree. They kind of shield the other plants. The other ones. Those are big.
So why did they grow in such non-straight ways? In split?
I believe that's a way that's kind of, they're trying to help out other plants by moving around, having their trunks move around, so it will cover more areas.
It could also be
because they need more sun.
yeah. It's also because
They need more sun.
they spread out so that they can get more sunlight.
And they take it
More
from
leaves,
And so
more
that
trunks equals more leaves.
also,
Equals more
since
food.
they shield it off,
when the leaves drop, it gives sunlight to the leaves.
and also that the little trees don't burn up, and they also don't drown in too much water, so
They die.
Okay, so here's what I want everyone to see. Is that what happens here is that Una, the 9-year-old, really narrates a series of helping relationships or ecological relationships. And what she does is she mobilizes Grandma Cedar to respond to these kind of spontaneous questions. And she's really working through, like, what's the tree canopy? How does it shade sproutlings? And if you'll notice, when we talk about more than human personhood, what you can see in her language here is that she's actually assuming trees have internal states. They're kind of like the grandma cedar tree. They kind of shield the other plants, and she says, I believe that's kind of they're trying to help out other plants by moving around. So we see a kind of invocation of the grandmother cedar story from 12 hours earlier in instruction, and a kind of systems reasoning, and the tree's relationship to multiple parts of a forest ecosystem. By the way, these are all the kinds of things that foresters pay attention to. They go on, and you see a teacher ask a fairly straightforward question, form function question that often gets asked to kids. And you can see that they get there, right? So essentially, the older students say, because more leaves, more trunks equals more leaves equals more photosynthesis. But what also happens is we see that they navigate back to the sort of grandmother cedar paradigm, where Renee says, and since they shield it off, when the leaves drop, it gives sunlight to these, and also the little trees don't burn up, and they also don't drown too much in the water. What I want everyone to notice here is that there's like rapid navigation across kind of knowledge systems here that actually is deep collective sense making about dynamics in ecosystems. That is kind of spontaneously happening in response to questions. For us, this is an example of what it looks like when you're creating learning environments and kids are spontaneously using their Indigenous knowledge systems, or if you weren't doing this with Indigenous kids, their knowledges from home towards more sophisticated and complex reasoning without it necessarily being cued, is a really important indicator that you've created a different kind of learning environment. I want to be clear here, as I transition to the next example, is that I also think it's really important, I want to pull Suzanne Simard through, is that Una's reasoning sounds very similar to Suzanne Simard's reasoning, who's transformed the field of plant sciences over the last 30 years. And partly what happens is that when we're out of touch with the edges of the disciplines that we're trying to create learning environments for, sometimes how we start to hear children is disconnected, and we don't actually see relationships between what children are saying and doing, and what the trajectories towards more expertise are. So I'm going to move here to just say that partly, and this is partly, I don't always say it like this, but I want to say that part of being anti-racist requires supporting and engaging Indigenous presence, brilliance, and leadership. And that means taking seriously knowledge systems as relevant and important for young people to be able to learn about and engage with. There's a whole other theories of things here that the only thing that I'm gonna say that I feel like I haven't is that this learning environment and a lot of what we're after is trying to refuse kind of normative forms of power in history by recreating kind of the conditions of knowledge exchange between long-term knowledge paradigms, and sort of thinking about it as, is it possible to construct relations between indigenous peoples and Western knowledges, or indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems that can actually co-produce generative futures together? And you can't do that unless you can model it and actually help create it. So that's part of what we've been up to in this learning environment. And I think the other piece that I'll just say is that, like, if you see Una, even though Una wasn't doing very well in science class at this time in school, when we start to look in these ways, I think we would all argue that this is pretty brilliant for a 9-year-old who's trying to make spontaneous sense and is reasoning around complex systems as she's doing. I'm going to transition just for time-wise now into my second example called Learning in Places, which was mentioned in the beginning. And really this project was trying to take seriously these issues of nature-culture relations and issues of power and historicity into school-based learning environments serving multiracial, multilingual learners. And I'm gonna, well, we'll see where we go. So this is a model was co-designed with families, with educators, with school leaders and scholars over about 2.5 years. And then it's been implemented and piloted multiple times. And so all of what you're about to see did not exist when we started it. All of it was built, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I also want to say that this model was built for PK3. Now we're implementing it across 3 states from PK5, and it's already in motion with middle schoolers and high schoolers. For example, for those of you who might know the Open SciEd resources, Open SciEd has used some of our materials in their high school. So while the model I'm going to show you is for young children, I even work with folks who are teaching undergraduate science and are using some of these materials. So what did we build? We call this our tools, our material tool ecosystem. There's kind of 4 major components. So we have our project rhizome, which is kind of our principles of learning and core practices of learning. We ended up with our educator frameworks, and we have a ton of them now. And then we have storylines, and we actually end up with 3 storylines where should we's and wonderings that I said I would say more about from iSteam is really central to. So we have a classroom storyline, what we call a family storyline, and then we have a specific garden storyline. And then there are a series of learning engagements, which are kind of bundled sets of lesson plans that either can stand on their own or you can use them to adapt to whatever curricular resources are being used in a classroom. Okay, so I'm going to try to walk through at least these materials a little bit, partly to pull through, like, how are we trying to actually transform nature-culture relations and what are the components? And then I'm going to show you some data about what we're learning. So you shouldn't make sense of all of this yet, and all of this is available online for free, by the way, all of it. So all of the learning engagements, all of the frameworks, all of it's free. So you all can look for that later. But what I want to just point out is that our rhizome, this is what we call our rhizome, is grounded in nature-culture relations and power and historicity. And then we have these other 3 components, which we call cultures, families, and communities, complex socio-ecological system, which is really the phenomena that we're after. And then in this particular case, field-based science learning. I will also say our new iterations are intentionally interdisciplinary. So we're doing science, literacy, and social studies in robust curriculum for PK5. Turns out usually it's the same teacher that teaches all of them, and disciplinary segregation might create time wars. But so we're really, sorry, that's a little bit of sarcasm. We're really trying to figure out, like, how do you create more robust learning environments that meet multiple learning demands? Here is a kind of overview of many of our frameworks for educators. These we did not know we would need. Educators asked for these. And we were about 3.5 years in, and it was like, this is great. It's a completely different paradigm. I feel like I went through teacher education again. And I need tools to help me hold the big picture ideas and kind of cheat sheets for some of the practices that I'm going to continually work on. We got to frameworks to do that. One of the things that is important to hold is these frameworks structure all the kind of classroom material tools that actually support the storyline. And there were 4 kinds of tools that we developed. Learner tools that are for individual use in classrooms and home. Family tools, which are designed specifically for families to use together routinely. Group tools and learning environments, so whole groups of kids or whole classes or small groups of kids, and then educator tools. And so across this were all these types of tools that we built in to the entire project. Okay, so here's our storyline. I'm going to walk you through this, so don't try to make sense of this. This is our representation of what does it look like to engage in this storyline. And I'm going to try to decode it so you can see the components of it, because it's a lot if you're not able to sit with it for a little while. So the first thing that I want everyone to notice in our storyline is that for us, beginnings matter. And so we start with histories of places and phonology, or science of the seasons. And to the right is the graphic for the histories of places framework. And partly what I just want to elevate here is that even when we're teaching science or when we're teaching mathematics, we're teaching history too. And we can obscure all different kinds of histories. And in this storyline, we were really insistent on making sure that the social histories, both of Indigenous peoples' time and nation state time, were always present. And one of the things that is often missing in classrooms is this idea of living ethical responsibilities and possibilities time. So we were trying to make sure that we were open to actually supporting kids' agency, speculative imagining about possible futures as always part of learning environments. Okay, so there are kind of 5 key layers to this model of learning that's really important. So the first is kind of in learning environments, fairly standard, but you can see it through this layer right here. The second is, just for everyone who's wondering, this is kind of NGSS aligned, so you can accomplish school ends that might be normatively needed. And really what you should see is actually some of the inquiries pretty straightforward, actually, except for that kids are outside collecting data in the field or in gardens, as well as with their families in their neighborhoods, as routine to all investigations. What is really the point here is that it is more than field trips. So usually what we get is like, oh, great. So it's an investigation with a field trip. That's not actually how scientists do their work. They don't visit the field once. They engage in multiple observations and different kinds of data collection in same places. And so we were really trying to embed those routine practices in and across. So you can see that there's in learning environments and in the field happening across the storyline. And then I think one of the things that has probably been most important to a lot of people is actually to recognize, like, how is it that we really engage with families and communities in more than anecdote? And our family storyline and our family tools is one way to integrate family knowledges and practices and values across the investigation. And so we have this whole suite of tools for teachers to be able to use to engage families. The other reason this is really important is that we get lots of teachers who will say things like, I have kids from 15 different countries who speak 8 different languages. I can't possibly engage all of their knowledge systems. And part of that is an approach problem. And for us, this was a way to actually make that feasible to do for educators and actually improve their instruction and being able to see kiddos' reasonings in the way we just saw with Una. The last thing about this model of education is that it's driven by should we questions. So we think about those as questions that prompt socio-ecological deliberation and ethical decision making, and really actually motivate the need for scientific investigations to matter. And usually in NGSS, we talk about it as communicating explanations and proposing solutions. We've really thought about this as like, okay, this is actual change making prompted by investigation and data and evidential use in ways that actually are transformative in local lived lives. And so we kind of bookend, right, where you start and where you end in these investigations should be pulled throughout. And so the what should we do question is kind of baked in across the storyline. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do now is tell you, I'm going to skip this and tell you about like 2 things. What are we learning? So the first is the where of learning matters. I'm going to show you that. And then I'm going to tell you about issues of power and how they're replicated in outdoor learning environments that are super necessary to attend to. And I don't give a talk without talking about this anymore. So this first one comes from a study of activity configuration, right? So I'm arguing here that kids should be learning outdoors, and we should be thinking about actually models of education that engage outside, right, to a part of kinds of models. So one way we've studied this is that we looked at we infrastructured two basic activity structures in the family-based activities, those family tools. One were indoor discourse-based activities, and one were outdoor discourse and observational kind of mobile activities, families walking around the neighborhood and making observations. We did this with 29 families we had sets of both indoor tools and outdoor tools. And the specifics of the prompts were a little bit variable, but the big content was really, really similar across these tools, or at least paired in the tools. So what we did is we analyzed all of these family tools. And what we did is we analyzed them for what we call the base relationships in ecosystems. And this is based off a lot of developmental science. But there's really these big categories of kind of relational reasoning. How are they reasoning about species? So animal and plant relationships, places, right? The relationship in animals and plants relationship to particular places. And then what we might call natural kinds, which means how are you reasoning about soil, water, wind, rock, sunlight. So these tools were all coded for these base relationships. And we distinguish between human animals and non-human animals in families reasoning. Here's what we found. On the left are the family discussion, and the red family of codes is when humans are central to reasoning. What we might see here on this left in the family discussion is the replication of a human apart from kind of model, where humans are distinct and the center of reasoning. On the right is the family walks, right? Those are the outdoor activity pools. And what we're seeing is a huge shift that on family walks, there's still some human reasoning present, but there's actually a much bigger shift to think about relationships between plants, between animals and plants, between plants and kinds, but we see actually a real shift away from human-centered reasoning. And so part of what we're arguing here is that this is a kind of evidence that being outdoors actually supports a part of forms of observation and reasoning that even within the same families, you see the kinds of ways that different changes in learning environments supports a different kind of reasoning. Okay, I think I have about 9 more minutes. I'm gonna transition here to think about practice issues. So on the right is our example of our power and historicity framework. And part of why I sort of started here and what I think is really important is helping to empower educators to see how deep issues of power are being replicated in our learning environments in places where we have agency and power to do something about them. And so in this project, we started with this idea of interpretive power developed by Ann Roseberry and Beth Warren and colleagues at the Shoshay Conan Center, where they talked about these two different orientations. A behavioral stance is one in which teachers are tending to interpret children's activity, ideas, bodies through their behavior, and they tend to focus on things like control and compliance, tends to be shaped by kind of middle-class European American practices and values, and it often can be the space in which deficit views are re-entrenched. And for them, they talk about the interpretive power moving towards a sense-making stance, where there is some attention to the discourse practices, noticing student sense-making, and really it demands educators to have a greater attunement to students' ideas and the kind of generativity of student sense-making. What I just did with you, with Yuna and the previous example, I was trying to get you into a sense-making stance. In our work in trying to support educators, what happens after a sense-making stance? And we would argue that there's a kind of ethical design, pedagogical design, decision-making that happens. And that when we can get here, when we can move from sense-making to like actually owning the power and agency that we have in micro moments of teaching and learning, that we start to see how we can intentionally transform the moments in interaction that actually are reproducing those dynamics, even if unintentional, which means that we get to greater engagement with family and community knowledges, remediation of normative assumptions of educators and students. And for us, it has meant the co-construction of should we questions and answers in powerful ways. I'm going to show you a negative example of what happens if you don't do this, but also tell you that part of what has been helpful is when we've started to see these things, being able to make visible when and where do we replicate, and how is it that we continue to grow attunement in ways that could end this. So this, I'm going to show you a vignette from a second grade classroom who was going on a wandering walk, which is the beginning part of our storyline. And this is the park next to their school. And their wandering walk was really focused on like, what decisions have humans made here, right? What are you noticing about the environment and what decisions have humans made here? And so I'm going to show you a quick video. And what I would like you to try to pay attention to, I'm going to show you a part, I'm going to stop for a minute, and then I'm going to show you a second part. But notice Nick. Nick is a second grade African-American boy. And what I really want you to notice is, how is Nick engaging and how are others engaging with him? And I want you to think about whether or not you're noticing power. And then I have to, I'm sorry, but I have to go to, not that, I have to go to this. Okay, hopefully you all can see this. And here we go.
Baby tree! Baby tree! Look, a baby. Sasha, Etta.
Oh, baby tree!
A little. It's a pine tree.
No,
I think it's an evergreen, actually. I never seen a baby tree like that.
My step.
Where did you find that shell?
So you know what makes me think
Where is
there's
that? Be
something
careful.
here that I'm seeing a ton of?
What?
So, what do you think? Was this recent or over a year ago?
I think it was over a year ago. No, I'm sure it's recent. Recent, and maybe some of it was over a year ago. I even see. What? How did a charger? Look at this. There's even a charger here.
Yeah.
So look, there's
Who would?
Well, it's kind of interesting to see one again.
over there, and there's none here. So my God, there's
And look, there's even a charger.
everywhere. Samuel, please stop kicking that. You're kicking up dirt and making dust go everywhere.
Okay. So what I want everyone to notice for a second is that there is this moment that is about to unfold. And Nick is really taken with how did this charger? And I want to remind everyone that the job here is to notice all the different, make observations of the different species, and to think about what human decision making do we see. And so we see Carly at this end. Nick is saying, who would put, and he says, and look, there's even a charger. And Carly says, Nick, please stop kicking that. You're kicking that there and making dust go everywhere. And I'm gonna just pause there because this is a kind of moment where if you're paying attention, you might do something different than what we're about to see.
Can I make a suggestion? She just asked you to stop doing something. Did you stop? Listen, did you stop? Why?
Because it looks so weird.
Okay, but she said the dirt was going in their eyes. Is that okay?
She never said they were going.
She said she's kicking up dirt. So come here, friend. Turn off the camera a second. Come here.
I can't.
We need to talk. Turn it off for a second.
I can't.
Okay. So here's what I want to say. Partly as a way, where did my slide go? Here's what I'm hoping that everyone is noticing here. Is what we see here is that Nick was vying for intellectual attention. He was really engaged. He was noting baby trees. He was responding to other people's observations, but Nick was deeply engaged. And then we see him make this observation about actually a really interesting thing. How did a computer charger end up? And Carly says, please stop kicking that. And the first time we actually see the teacher engage with him is responding to Carly's vie for the teacher, to Carly's response to his behavior. And part of what we see really fast here is a kind of behavioral stance where Miss Rivers is actually asserting physical compliance, the policing of Nick's body, literally turning off the camera. And she's really asserting a kind of intellectual compliance. She won't engage with Nick's sense making until he deals with this issue of kicking the charger. Now, I just want to be clear, it's possible that kicking the charger is an important thing. But what I want everyone to notice is there are all kinds of intellectual kinds of things happening. And what we see here is actually the reproduction of white women policing a Black boy's body. And what I also want to say is that Nick is learning that and he's quickly seeing it. And you can kind of hear him be like, she never said I was getting in her eyes. She just said, stop kicking that. And I didn't do that, is a kind of way to read this. The other thing to recognize is that Carly is learning something here too, right? So we see interactions here between Nick and Miss River that is a replication of lots of history and a really normative relationship between Black men and white women. But Carly is also learning about vying for power. And here's what I'd say. This is something we all need to think about. This happened to have unfolded at the same time when the birding incident in New York unfolded, where a white woman threatened to call the cops on Christian Cooper when he asked her to put her dog on a leash. My point about this is why we've used this with educators is to help understand how these micro moments in interaction, Nick will probably be fine, and yet Nick is having these kinds of experiences as young as second grade and probably earlier that accumulate over time to produce these large scale kind of inequalities in our society. And so for us, this is a way to actually help educators get inside the kinds of moments in teaching and learning environments that are reproducing potential harms that lead to accumulated large scale inequalities. So I think that I'm going to end for time, but I just want to kind of say that really, hopefully I've pulled a thread here through about both the relationship between apart from and a part of models and their relationships to history and power, and the ways in which actually these issues of inequality are typically baked in to kind of everyday interactions. And there's not a sort of one size fits all. It's actually a transformation of how we engage with children and how we think about the relationship between children learning and the kinds of learning targets. So I think I'll stop there. If you want more, here's some info, and happy to take questions. And I'll pop these in the chat for those who want, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all that you shared. We have some questions coming in. If you have other questions for the Zoom attendees, you can add your questions to the Q&A there at the bottom. Just click on it and the questions will come into us, and I'll read a few of them, time permitting. And then for the folks that are at the watch party, if you have a question, I think they have a system set up for how to share those questions. You can share them in the Q&A. Someone can text them to me, one of the profs that's there, and I can share a few of the questions here. So here we go. I'll just take these in the order that they're coming in. So what future consequences do you believe will result should our species not forfeit its insistence upon its supremacy? And have you personally seen any reason to be optimistic that any strategy will convince those who stubbornly cling to human supremacy that they will somehow be moved to change?
Yeah, so that's a dark and not great question. I appreciate it though. Here's what I'll say. I mean, if we take seriously the projections and the kind of ecological collapses that are happening in real time right now, in the United States, everyone's sort of buffered from it. We never actually deal with the scale of biodiversity loss. Those projections are that we have serious ecological shifts that we need to deal with, and that there are consequences for things like climate refugees all over the place. And we can take, the New York Times had a really lovely article about the number of multi-billion-dollar events that the United States is enduring. So I think we will have to learn this. The question is how violent it will be to learn it. And I kind of hope for that maybe human beings will decide to actually be kind and generous and decide that our collective well-being is more important than individual belief systems or individual thriving. And here's what I'll tell you, that first map, just to say, do I think it's possible? Yes, because I think that there are places in the world where Indigenous peoples have continued to govern, where biodiversity is still present, where thriving ecosystems is still present. So is it possible? For sure. I think it's a core challenge about how do human beings learn at a social scale, at a societal scale.
Thank you. I've got another question that I'm going to read, and it's long, but I want to read the whole thing because I don't want to. I think there's a lot in here. So I was struck by your comment earlier that in the talk about the ways that Indigenous and Western sciences can work together to synergistically produce new knowledge. That's very powerful. In response to more attention being placed on science, misinformation, and disinformation, some are suggesting placing more of a focus on credibility, in quotes, in science education, focusing on social institutional practices of sciences like peer review, relevant expertise, consensus, etc., to establish reliable knowledge. Being able to evaluate credibility seems like an important skill in today's society, but it might also function to exclude other knowledge systems, such as Indigenous ways of knowing, which have its own ways of establishing reliable and credible knowledge. Are there ways we can teach about reliability and credibility in science without doing that in a way that excludes Indigenous sciences and ways of knowing?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think we need to be careful about this. So first of all, if we think about the different ways in which science and science education have sort of been discredited over history, this isn't a new practice, right? Like as there's a political right movement, there's often been a going after particular science and particular responses to it. I'm thinking about the 90s and all kinds of ways that kind of movements towards intelligent design and not teaching evolution was the real push. Here's what I'll say to you. I actually think we need to, I think that what is productive and human, right, is that we need to imagine learning environments where there are actually multiple ways of knowing, and that we don't engage in only bifurcated debates about who is right and who is wrong. And I think that if actually you study, like a lot of the most famous scientists in the world were also religious folks, right? And that people can engage in productive knowledge development with different tools for knowing. And oftentimes what we do in education is we presume it's a kind of double deficit view of children. We sort of imagine that kids can't do that really sophisticated thinking in the first place. So we have to make it clear and precise, and that's the best way to get kids along. And what that means is what we can't ask them to make complex decisions, or that we can't engage them in complex learning around multiple meaning systems. And I say that right now, it's a complicated terrain, but I think this question is spot on, because I do think what is called credible right now, and Suzanne's work is really a great example, is 30 years ago, Suzanne wasn't credible. Her science and plant science wasn't credible science. And so the complicated intersection here is how it is that we think people are capable of navigating kind of the social complexity we're talking about, and teaching people how to decide, like, what is reliability and what is credibility, and what is not biased. Like the point is that there's actually biases playing out in lots of different directions. And I think that bifurcated, like, let's argue about who is right and who is wrong, which is the only way to know, is actually the history of colonization. And for me anyway, if we're insisting on one right way of knowing, what that has meant for Indigenous people is incredible violence to either become Christian or become Western knowers. So I just, for me, if we can't figure out a different solution and we use credibility and kind of attacks on broader things as the reason to continue down assimilative roads, I don't actually think it's going to solve the civil problem, the civil kind of the civic engagement problem that you're talking about right now either.
Thank you. I've got one more that's coming in from the watch party, and I think this is all we're going to have time for. How can white educators integrate Indigenous ways of knowing in their teaching practice without participating in cultural appropriation?
Great question. We have a whole framework about that, so I'll say that. I mean, I think that one of the ways to do that is to make sure you understand whose land you're on and what they would say and what is important to them. I also think there's lots of published materials at this point. And I feel like partly what becomes super important is to think about how it is that you're constructing a narrative of Indigenous peoples, right? I think that partly doing the work of understanding your own context first before you go and ask Indigenous peoples to support your work is really important, because I think oftentimes what I end up getting is like, I don't know anything about Native people or Indigenous peoples, teach me everything. And there's plenty of resources out now to do that in informed ways. But it also means being deliberate about forming partnerships and being able to really engage with the places that you're in, and not just doing kind of monolithic indigenous peoples. So it is a good question, and I would take it slow, but make sure that you're actually partnered with Indigenous peoples, not just teaching about us.